For any folks that weren't here on the governance session last week, the recording is available. I'm going to touch at a high level on the things that we were discussing in terms of our processes and how we'd like to use the sessions. And then we want to be able to jump into actually kind of framing a little bit about how the Pan-Canadian data content standard has been translated into the profiles that we're going to review in future sessions as a kind of high level. This is the approach to prepare us for reviews in January. So as a recap of the governance session that we had last week, we wanted to kind of ensure that it made sense from the perspective of our timelines to use our sessions this way, and confirm that we're comfortable as long as we're addressing any breaking changes or breaking like validation issues, using our Friday calls between now and the February 9th to go through and take the time to do a community review and collection of feedback toward the CA core profiles. The other component that we need to ensure as part of this process, because we know a lot of folks, maybe even that are on the call right now, are not part of our traditional CA baseline Friday crew, is just to make sure that we're putting communication very clearly out on a couple different agendas or a couple different channels, so that folks know if they're interested in having a little bit more of this targeted review, even if they haven't participated in the baseline in the past, we'll attempt to capture them. We did decide last week that we will, rather than be like tracking individual who submitted or who raised a particular comment as we do our community review and we provide the feedback from like a line item CA Fire baseline community perspective, that we'll be tracking it as the CA baseline Fire community as the submitter, but like we've done with similar processes in the past, we'll be tracking kind of internally if there are individuals who had raised the topic that wanted to be part of the follow-up, so that we can help kind of bridge that gap if necessary, while still submitting under the kind of CA Fire baseline community umbrella. As part of kind of the review, and this is one of the key pieces here, is that, you know, we're doing something that really hasn't been done, at least in the last number of years in our community. And so we tried to set out some kind of principles for how we would conduct the review. What's our perspective and our focus when providing feedback? And so we broke it really into kind of 3 steps, like in prioritization order. So our first kind of lens should be identifying any places where we have CA baseline constraints that are significantly different than what we have within the profiles that are being proposed for the CA core patient practitioner organization and practitioner role. So similar to the process that we've undergone with our due diligence reviews in the past, we're looking for places where the baseline has a rule that isn't met or kind of acknowledged or exceeded by the core profile as the target for the review. The second component is looking at the modeling specifically that's being highlighted in this round. So taking a lens to the attribute definitions and the mappings that have been provided. So do these make sense as a community that often has to do the same kind of type of interpretation? Does the element to element mapping make sense? As well as there's going to be a few places where within the core profiles, call out specific areas for community feedback around modeling and expectations, around the use of a certain resource for a given mapping. And then also getting feedback on things like the slice modeling that's in place, and particularly the obligations. So this would be more generically outside, like, is the logic that's presented, does it make sense? And responding to like specific areas where further exploration is needed and asked for. The last piece is, you know, if we do identify there's, you know, a challenge within our jurisdiction, oftentimes when we look at any of our CA baseline profiles, we do it from the perspective of, you know, what is the impact that might have to my registry profile or my lab profile or my implementations that I work with every day, and still keeping that perspective in place. And then the most important piece, I think, is, you know, we're going to try this. Everything is going to be trial and error. There's a lot of grace in this space because it hasn't been done this way before. We're kind of a a target group for doing this more communal review. But we can ask for more time if we find that the kind of the sessions that we've laid out aren't giving us the time that we need to walk through each profile and feel like we're collecting or have enough time to collect the kind of the feedback that we want to. The session schedule that we talked about last week.
I have a question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
And I apologize because you may have talked about this. When you say terminology and cardinality are out of scope, what do you mean? Like just comments on those are out of scope? Is that what you mean?
So and I'll talk to this in a second, but so because this is essentially it's a preliminary round, the content that's been translated is just data elements. It doesn't have any defined terminology and it doesn't have any cardinality in the framework yet. So there really aren't any of those profile choices that have been applied.
So it's really, are these the right data elements in the profiles that people need and or want? And then
and what people would expect in the places where we see an extension, does it make sense to approach it that way? That kind of first level view.
Okay.
Any other questions on this part of the recap before we just go to the sessions and then actually talk a little bit about dive into questions like Jean's?
I'm not sure. My question is kind of out of scope or not, but I heard that there's some data set behind to build this SAE core. Is that right?
So there will be and I'll talk about this in a second. So what we're using to translate to date the content from the framework into the profiles is called the data content standard. There are data sets that will be part of the framework that are going to be more domain specific. So at this point in time, the data set isn't used, but there will be data sets in the future. And I think we've got folks from ChiHi, like when we get to that point, I think we've got folks from ChiHi that can also provide more content.
Thank you.
So I know we're all itching to do this. The only thing I wanted to flash on the screen is we thought that this was kind of a reasonable way to start approaching this, where we have at least the first profile that we go through. We have like at least kind of 2 sessions, one on January 5th, where we take a portion of it. And because we know it's going to be a learning curve going through this process, trying to have the January 12th for that as well. We're going to post this on the FHIR implementers and the other forums so that folks are familiar with this. And then we can talk about which profile we want to start with. I thought patient might be a good place. It's the heftiest one, but I thought it made sense to have kind of the later January reviews more towards practitioner and practitioner role because they can be helpful to understanding context. But that's for us to decide, at least in terms of the sequencing. This is kind of what's been discussed to date. So without further ado, there's 2 links I'm going to put in the chat. The first is just to the project. And then the second one is to the versioned guide. And I will pull up the version guide on my screen. Okay, so important to note, I'm going to talk through the framing, like the approach, but I'm going to use the guide to do that because we knew that not everybody would be available to get the verbal on these calls. And we wanted to have the kind of framing of what did we use to start translating expectations into profiles in a kind of a static view that folks could interact with as they desire. Originally, the scope was, let's just put out the first 4 profiles: patient, practitioner, organization, practitioner role. But for that reason, and for the reason of like having a little bit of improved rendering experience for folks to actually do these reviews, we did some kind of supplementary pages around the guide. So it's not going to be a fulsome guide like what you would expect, but it's just enough to kind of frame the scope of what's available and how the profiles have been developed to date. So each one of the components I'm going to talk about today has its own kind of page to it. I'm going to start on just the project background real quick. So for those of us that have been on the calls for the last few months, this probably looks familiar. the most important thing to know about our approach is that I'm going to put on my kind of InfoWay CA core development hat on now, because we've talked a lot about how the CA baseline is an input in the past in our calls, but I want to talk to you about from the perspective as somebody who's tried to take the content from CaiHi and translate it into the CA core profiles for review with this community. And so the most important thing to note is that the content that is going to be in the CA Core Plus project profiles is entirely a downstream product of the kind of the decisions and the constraints and the definitions that come out of this Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework, right? And that framework has multiple inputs into it. So you've got the working groups, one of our kind of products and our groups being an input into the space, but also the co-contributor groups. And the reason that this is important is that what it means is that when we look at the downstream byproducts that we have, those are being influenced in a number of different channels, and they're being incorporated into kind of interconnected content that then has to be kind of transposed into FHIR profiles. And so what that means at this point in time, because effectively we've opted to be able to try to profile this very early in the development phase of the framework, is that we know that what we're going to look at not only is going to evolve, but that the way that we provide feedback and that we react to it and look at it from the lens of FHIR will also help to have the framework evolve itself. We have to look at it from the lens of what does this interpretation of these elements and expectations mean from an interface perspective and from the scope of how we use a FHIR profile. But part of what we're trying to do in not waiting to the very end to put a profile in place is to allow for and to trial this more kind of bi-directional synchronization. But it's going to mean work, and it's going to mean patience, and it's going to mean that the content we look at today, we have to know we're not building against it, because this is a very early preview and it will go through multiple rounds. The piece that I want to call out that speaks to both Jean and Thomas's question, which is what are the components that to date we think will likely translate more directly into FHIR profiles. So the content in the guide that's expected to be part of, I'll say, part of the CA Core Plus project is really broken up into two pieces. The common data exchange profiles. So these would be things that they are constraints that we would be, expecting to be shared and demonstrable across FHIR implementations, more than the lowest common denominator. But these are the things that as authors, we will eventually harmonize around and will be a kind of a bar to act against. The second piece is the domain-specific data exchange profiles. And so these are profiles that build on top of those common ones and that are really applicable only in certain contexts. So they have constraints that might be relevant to certain actors, certain use cases, certain contexts. For the purposes of the version that we're putting out right now, we're just, because it's very small, we're just looking at these kind of common data exchange profiles. And even though there are many components that are interconnected within the framework, right? So we know that, there's the business context model, and that there is a conceptual data model and a logical data model, and that there are these data sets like Thomas mentioned, and a data content standard and value sets, and you get the point. That the piece that we anticipate will most likely translate into the profiles is going to be some combination of the data standards and the logical data models. So at this point in time, we have the elements from like the preliminary list of elements from the primary healthcare data content standard. And so important to note that when we're reviewing it, we're kind of only looking at this from like the first layer view, but that eventually we'll look at this from the perspective of comparing it against things like the logical data models as well. But because it's early, those are haven't really been flushed out, developed yet. We're going to stick to the kind of time bounds of this was what was available kind of in November for the element definitions, and like put on our blinders there so that we're ready for the next round, which will have kind of the next level of information around it. So I spoke a little bit to this earlier, but what we have from the data content standard to do the profiles that we're going to walk through over the next few weeks are really strictly the data element definitions at this point, because the goal is to get folks to agree, are these the data elements? Is this the right definition before the framework ever applies like conditional expectations around cardinality or value sets, etc. So this is a completely normal part of the process that we're in. We're just really early in it. And so we focus on what are the elements that have been defined so far in the kind of person, organization, and care team member space, and how do they translate to these first 4 profiles. One of the things that is an area that I think is going to be really critical for this community to provide feedback on, that I want to just call out right off the bat, is that you know, a huge underlying tenet of the Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework is person centricity. When we talk about what a person means in FHIR, that also carries additional implementation context. And so for the scope of the profiles that have been identified to date for what's in this version, we haven't profiled for person yet. We've profiled the elements against patient and done the mappings for what it would mean for person. But we understand that there is an implication to applying and incorporating person into kind of our expectations for what gets exchanged. And we want to hear from folks about what the implications of and where it makes sense to kind of to start to try to incorporate some of these constraints against person in our current kind of exchange contexts, right? Because there might be clearer pathways like registries, but there's a question around, you know, how does this work then for, you know, use of patient in addition to person, or use of person in other systems like care delivery and billing. And so we're specifically asking for that feedback and to kind of think on that. But it's not to say that even though this is person-centric, we're making the intentional choice to use patient. It's just, this is where we're at within the scope and where we're looking for more feedback. Lorraine, I see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to be really careful when it comes to looking at person.
Yeah.
Because in the base spec, there's very specific rules and intent for person. So I actually wouldn't expect the person resource to show up in a clinical delivery system.
Yeah, I see we've got Thomas, you've got your hand as well.
Yeah, I might not just as you would have said, but let's just pop up some questions here. So for this core will be the continuity of the baseline. There's no any consideration or consultation with the HL7 International regarding to move up to another version of a FHIR or stages with the R4.
So this one is in R4. There are some things that we'll talk about today that, or I guess we'll talk about it closer to patient. Structures that we have created as R4 structures to deal with some of the versioning challenges, but at least the scope to date has been R4 because the goal is to put forward content that many of our implementation guide authors can use off the bat, and many of us are working in R4. Finney? But please do, like, if there are certain areas, put that in. Let's like make sure we put that in the feedback if there are areas you're looking at in R5. Finney, you had your hand up?
Yeah, thanks, Sheridan. So just for curiosity, were there a lot or were there new attributes that were created or added to the to these resources or extensions?
So there are a few extensions, and we'll actually, like when we get into the individual reviews, I'm going to show you the patient page today. There are a couple places where the mapping kind of made the most sense to an extension. As a practice, we tried to kind of select the extensions first by what has been defined internationally and what's reused very frequently. And then there's, I think, one place in practitioner where there's a proposed extension for additional details there isn't an equivalent or anything like it in HL7 International. So the answer is yes, but the degree kind of varies.
Okay, and the intent is to move or at least propose those extensions to international?
I think it would be eventually, but this is still so early stages. I think we would definitely want to talk about, like, is the mapping to take an approach to map this concept to an extension appropriate? Is this the right modeling of the extension? And does it make sense for us to kind of implement this as like 3 steps typically before you would try to promote it internationally? Like, we'd want some stabilization that we feel good about the modeling and the extension choice.
Yeah. So the other question I have is the data set. So the assumption is the data set would be a subset of the bigger data model, right?
Yeah,
So
and
there are no-
I'll lean on Christine to give the exact details there, but like, we're gonna look at the data content standard, and the data sets are kind of in a more domain specific. Is that correct, Christine? But they are part of the overall.
Yeah, so Finney, you're correct. There's one main data content standard that we're going to iterate over time to include multiple domains of care. But from that, we'll have it packaged into purpose-driven data sets. So one example would be the Canadian version of the International Patient Summary. That would be one of your examples. E-referral, e-consult, and I could probably name a number of them, some for clinical use as well. But it's just one core data content standard that includes the data elements, definitions, the value sets, as well as their definitions, and then a logical data model that models all of this into one common source of truth.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Christine.
You're welcome.
There's another page I want to make. I'd like to just show you guys what the profile pages look like, but I want to just call out a little bit. So at the start of really any project, one of the things that, particularly in more abstracted profiling, that I typically like to do is to outline some underlying principles and some underlying structures that guide certain practices and decisions that are made consistently across the board. We talked a little bit about this common data exchange profiles and domain-specific exchange profiles. I'm gonna just put a note here that one of the things that I think would be helpful for us to talk about as a community as we go through these types of reviews is that there may be places where there's patterning, or there might be a place where I've applied an interpretation of something that kind of sits somewhere in between, where maybe it's not like the element is common, but maybe it's only applicable for under certain contexts or actors. And so it's less specific than saying this would be something that would be applicable to patient summary, but it isn't a structure we have to date. So it's something that I want us to kind of keep in mind as we're particularly reviewing some things in the practitioner space. And so there's just a couple examples of like elements that might be more relevant to registry contexts that aren't represented in the profiles to date, but it would be helpful to understand what the implications are to different approaches that we have for addressing that. So, you know, whether it's to have, like we've done in the baseline, a practitioner registry profile, or to use other kind of tools that we have at our disposal for, you know, applying, this is a rule that really only applies to this type of actor in a single profile itself. So I don't have the answer today. I just want folks to know that it is a question, and it's a question that this community can help with. The other pieces that I want to call out is that some of the mechanisms that have been deployed in this guide, particularly obligations, have been done so because there are some underlying principles about how we would like the core to be used. So it's really important that the artifacts that are developed under the CA Core Plus project are modular, they're testable, and they can be combined in such a way that when our kind of vendors come to our ecosystem and they say, okay, I want to meet the combination of everything that's common and everything that's use case specific, that there's a really easy way to convey what those expectations are and to reduce duplication wherever necessary. One of the other kind of offshoots of that is that we want to lean into the mechanisms that are available to us in FHIR to take this kind of compilation-driven approach, not just in how the core profiles are structured, but also how we use content like the CA baseline. And so one of the things that I'll show today is just a kind of, as a teaser, the use of impose to impose the CA baseline constraints on the CA core profiles. So taking advantage of some of these mechanisms rather than just duplicating all of the constraints and expecting that we don't really use differential to its full potential. The other piece, and I want to talk a little bit about this obligation component. I'm not going to drill them into this a ton today because I think we want to look at this side by side when we're looking at our first profile. But as part of exploring obligations in the CA baseline over the last number of months and kind of assessing some of the values that they provide, one of the things that I've outlined in the guide, but is only kind of narrowly applicable in this version, is a logic for how we might take like an expectation strength that exists in the framework contents and translate them consistently into a logical pattern for obligations. And so this is kind of the proposed patterning. The only thing that you'll see in this version is the patterning that is applied to the optional pieces because we don't have these strengths. Like these are the element definitions that we have to date are still being confirmed and refined. And so without kind of, given that that work hasn't occurred yet to define both the expectations and the cardinalities and the value sets, the profiles in this guide operate on the minimum assumption, which is if it's been identified, then at least we'll say, here are the kind of obligations that tie to something that would be optional, so that we're giving this community and other communities the chance to kind of provide feedback about what that tangibly means. Particularly helpful when we're looking at this stuff very early on in the process. So when we're asking for feedback, you'll see it directly, this pattern directly in the profiles for the optional, but we also want your feedback on what the pattern means for you for the other strengths, because it allows for us to pivot if, for instance, some of these things are too strong, or there's a better, more nuanced code that's part of the existing definition that we should consider. How that shows up in the profile pages is a table. So if we were using IG Publisher, you would see these in line. But because Simplifier has it in the, it's coming up in an upcoming release, but it isn't part of the release to date. This has just been rendered in the page view. But if you're a JSON freak like me, you can go in and see how the obligation's been applied. So within the pages, when we go to navigate them, and I'm keeping it to a framing perspective today so that like we're not digging into the patient profile until the 5th, but at least so that we know kind of what to expect and how to navigate it on our own. You'll see a link to how do you find the actual kind of profile page on profile page on Simplifier. So if you want to look at it from this view, so this would provide you with your kind of your detailed view. You can look at the mappings this way. I've also ported them into the guide. You can view it in XML or JSON. I actually find the JSON view can be helpful because you can, if you're interested in obligations, you can see kind of how they've been applied. But I think for the purposes of our reviews, it makes sense to try to get everything we need in one place. And so we'll see a differential view of what has been applied in terms of the profile. We'll see, this is one of the pieces, the pointer to, this is the version of the CA baseline profile that's been imposed on top of the CA core profile. And so we can click through and do that comparison side by side. Ties back to the question earlier about, do we want to keep it at 1.5 or make this 1.6? And then the obligation pattern. So this would be, where has an obligation been applied for instance, can send no error patterning. The last piece is the mappings. So effectively, the the version of the kind of data content standard that I received on, I think it was like November 9th, was when we locked down this round, is an Excel file that includes the data element and the data element definitions. And I've pulled the exact definitions, the exact data elements in that are related to a person, and the bioprofile elements that are in place, the mappings that have been applied, with some places for notes. It's important to note that not everything that has been tagged as a person, like under that person category right now, maps exactly to the patient. So there are places where, like I've called out, well, this would be the component, the element in the patient resource that would be used to get at this, but it's not exactly applying to the patient record itself. And there are some places where there are details that have been identified to date that haven't been mapped directly to patient because we think they're probably likely to be applied on another type of resource. So rather than the patient resource, details about a person's enrollment with a particular provider might be found within like care team. So that's to say that everything that is in that Excel for person is here. It's just a question of like, not everything is going to have a one-to-one mapping with the profile, but we didn't want to exclude those just because they didn't end up in the profile in this version. So the nice thing that we'll be able to do is, as we kind of go through this and we look at this from kind of not just the, okay, how well does this align to the CA baseline, but also how well do the mappings apply, and collecting feedback on particular sets of mappings that we think would need improvements or different like modeling choices, is that we'll have the folks from CIHI available to answer questions where we have them about this. Important to note that obviously these definitions will continue to be refined, but I think having that a little bit of additional support where we do have a question on it will be helpful. But I didn't want it to feel like it, basically everything that I know that I use to translate the profiles is on this page. So, well, obviously the complexity will increase in the future for our exercises and for the place that we're in. The goal is to feel like this is fully transparent and we're not holding anything back. But without digging into patient, what are the questions about the approach that's been taken to date and about our review that we can note and specifically tackle in the first half next session if we can't get to them in the next 5 minutes? Is this what folks were expecting?
Thanks, Sheridan. Just interested about the obligation, just thinking about this being the core, like so the context will be different. The obligations will be different, I would think, depend on the actual context. So for referral, sometimes you would need a name, or sometimes you don't need a name. So the obligations, can they be overridden? Maybe change when you're doing it on a certain context?
So you can apply addition. So it's a modeling choice about where you apply your obligations. The ones that are applied directly to the profile, if you are going to then reprofile, have to be met downstream. So you have to be very careful about which obligations you choose. But you can always add to them and you can further specify, which is a huge reason why, as part of the logic for like starting to map for the common data profiles, the logic proposes can send for these. So basically to say, if it's been identified in the framework and there is some underlying expectation that this is an element that our systems will consistently be able to at least support across a variety of different areas, even if it's not like populating it consistently. A code like CanSand, which is kind of the loosest in this grouping, which basically means, can you demonstrate you have a capability for this, but not, can you you will populate this, or you will display this in a UI, or you know, you've got to also include content in your narrative. Like the further down you go, the more restrictive it gets, and the harder it is to have something like that in a common profile that's going to be reused.
So just like cardinality, for example, you can tighten, but you can't loosen in a downstream context, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Which is really important in that the sense is like, I've applied this to the optional as an optional pattern. I've applied this as a pattern where something shows up as optional. But as we review this and we think from an implementer's perspective, okay, maybe something here maybe it exceeds what we think would be common and necessary to be demonstrable across the board. That's part of the feedback that we're looking for, because that will either tell us, you know, the logic should be tweaked because CanSand is even too strong for some of these elements, or we need something that's a little bit more nuanced than like a single rule that gets applied based off of that originating strength. And part of what I'm hoping we can do on the 5th, besides a recap a little bit of today, is to actually dive into what CanSand and no error means, so that when we look at, if we want to look at patient first, we have a good idea of like what the expectation means for these tables. Thomas, I see you got your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to based on what you said about this obligation. Can I see as a perception there will be a Pan-Canadian Fire server or fire engine on the plan or in the CAFEX?
Can you just expand a little bit more? So is it
Because
an
obligation
actual-
normally just put on the 2 endpoints, which is actually should be implemented in the operation API level, which is the part of architecture engines level in that manner. And actually it's pretty much rule sets. In that matter, my perception from what you just presented tells me there might be a fire server engine on the plan for the CAFEX to be implemented to facilitate those obligation implementation with the fire profiles. That's my understanding.
So what
Maybe
I
I'm
can
wrong.
say, and it's public, it's out today, the newest kind of CAFEX draft for comment, which is also out, very clearly states, like it points to this project and it says, like eventually we would like to be able to have a capability statement for servers. Like what are the capabilities that you support both in interaction and in like support of the payload profiles? Like eventually we'd like to get to that point where we could include these in the capability statement. But I think having an expectation for a capability statement is slightly different than like actually having a server for these. So definitely something we can talk about a lot more on the CAFEX front, but there's a bit in that guide that like talks to it a bit. Randy, I see you got your hand up, and then I know we're a little bit over, so I would say if you've got other questions, throw them in the chat and we can start at the top of the next session with them. Randy?
Just one quick thing. Are we using this obligation approach instead of using must supports anywhere, or is the must support still being complemented? Like having not looked to see if there is any there yet.
So there are no must supports declared on this. Effectively, what we're putting forward here is just the obligations to date. The goal is read it like when you see an obligation, you have a computable rule that you would otherwise call a must support. It's just that we're not applying the must support flags because we'd like to see if we can pursue obligations without having to go down that path.
Okay, it comes to me in context of with the e-referral stuff we're talking yesterday. They're trying to talk about doing must supports, removing it and whatever, but they don't really have a definition of the must support stuff. And so I was just wondering if we're going to be using it, we really should have a baseline or a core definition of must supports like we have for baseline.
Yeah, and I actually think like when I've been doing some work with Must Supports recently, the obligations are like a really good reference point. So even if you don't use the obligation mechanism, looking at these codes helps authors say, even if you're using Must Support today, like, what do you have to pick from, so that there isn't as much semantic challenges that we have when we try to write our statements. So I think it's worth to do this as a community and look at these and understand them, even if you're still writing a Must Support statement and using Must Support flags traditionally in your guides.
Yeah, I guess what I mean is that it's something that we should look at early on for this Canada Core, is making that kind of a statement of what we're intending with must support and obligations,
Yeah,
so that other projects can use the same approach.
that's good feedback. Okay, so I will leave you folks to spend your weekends clearly diving through the depths of this guide. But in reality, I think that we'll stop sharing. The content is available via those links. It's public for folks to peruse at their manner. We'll pick up on the 5th. I think we talked about in the last few sessions. I don't think we're going to have folks on the 22nd or the 29th, but we'll pick up with a initial review of the 5th. Probably starting with patient, but we're going to do a little bit of recap as well. So if I don't see you folks until the new year, have a wonderful, wonderful new year, and I will post the recording online shortly.